This is chapter 20, the GI system, and we're starting out with the functional anatomy. So this is really just laying the groundwork, the way that we typically do. Talk about the structures, talk about what organs are in place, and then we fill in the gaps with the physiology later on. Now, this should be a review for you at this point. We would have talked about most of these structures already in lab. And so this should be a review, a good review for your lab quiz as well, in terms of really organizing those structures, what's located where, and then we can add on the physiological layer, the functional layer in some of our future packets. Okay, I do want to kind of chat here a little bit about the gastrointestinal system. So I'm going to ask a question and you can respond in the chat. And I'm going to ask what you think is the most important functional aspect of the GI system. So what's the whole end goal of gastrointestinal structures, the entire system? Okay, great. So small intestine absorbing nutrients. That's a pretty big one. Absorption of nutrients, good. Filter out waste is a good one. Yes, definitely involved in some waste filtration there along the kidneys. Absorption, good. Absorption and solidifying waste. Yes. Excellent. Any other thoughts? Any other thoughts on the most important functional aspect of the gastrointestinal system? Okay, great. So these are some pretty big, important functional things. Absorption of nutrients probably being the most important one on that list, right? But as a byproduct, we're also going to solidify waste. We're going to remove toxins. We're going to remove byproducts as a process of absorbing those nutrients. And when we think about the absorption of those nutrients, it really underscores how the course is coming full circle. We began speaking about those macromolecules, we talked about carbohydrates, we talked about proteins, fats, and how important they are as substrates for cellular respiration. So we need those things essentially like wood for the fire, right? To burn in order to make ATP to sustain our cellular processes. And so talking about the gastrointestinal system here at the very end is kind of bringing all of that full circle. How do we get those carbs in? How do we get that glucose in? How do we get those fats, those proteins? How do we bring them in our diet, break them down to those macromolecules so that we can use them to do that cellular respiration that we talked about at the beginning? Okay, and that's the main goal of the gastrointestinal system, along with some other things, endocrine function and so on that we'll touch on as well. So our first objective here is to identify the various tissue layers and major organs that make up the GI system. So again, this is pretty much an overview from your gross anatomy structures. We're going to start right at the mouth and go all the way down to the anus and talk about all the structures that are involved, what they're doing, what their role is in terms of aiding with this absorption, which is the main function of the GI system. Now, just an overview here to start. The nutrients that we consume as they are just way too large to get into our bloodstream, right? We know this, right? You put a piece of bread in your mouth, there's no way you're going to be able to absorb that across your intestinal tract. And so nutrients have to undergo digestion. Digestion is the process of breaking things down into their smaller components. We go from fats to triglycerides, we go from proteins to amino acids, we go from bread, carbohydrates to glucose. And so that is the digestive process. That kind of begins in the mouth, but then really is, most of it happens in the stomach going forward in the small intestine, okay? We also wanna think about absorption. Absorption is where we move those nutrients, the smaller component, the micronutrients, across the intestinal tract, and we can bring those smaller components into the bloodstream so that they can be circulated and packaged, sorted, and used appropriately, okay? So there's the digestive part of it, breaking things down, and the absorption part of it, bringing it across the intestinal wall, the epithelial wall, into the bloodstream. The other two processes that are important here are motility and secretion. So motility and secretion aid digestion and absorption. If we think about the GI system as being this hollow muscular tube, we need some movement to move things down that tube, but we also need lubrication. We need secretion, which is moving mucus and fluids through the tract as well in order for those things to move through smoothly. So motility and secretion help to aid with moving things through the tract so that they can be broken down and absorbed. All right, and just looking at our schematic here, we start at the mouth where we have large pieces of food. Those become boluses as they move through the esophagus. Then they become a mixture called chyme. We'll talk about chyme. Chyme is that mulching that happens in the stomach where we have acid being secreted, and it's this slimy, semi-solid mixture. And then we move through the rest of the intestine. So the small intestine to start. This is where we really see more of that digestion, and then we begin to see absorption, right? We start to see that movement of these particles from the GI system, the GI tract, across into our blood system. And then we also are seeing secretion here. So the lubrication of the GI tract happens when we secrete mucus, secrete fluids out into the GI tract to help move those things along. And then at the very end, we're seeing what's left over, what's not been absorbed, being consolidated, solidified, and that can be excreted as waste. So if you think about the division of the gastrointestinal tract, it's this really long, hollow tube. It's a hollow muscular tube. It's about 15 feet long, so it's kind of coiled very nicely into our anatomy, but it's quite long. And it goes from the mouth to the pharynx being that shared opening between the nasal cavity and the oral cavity. From there, it goes to the esophagus, which is the tube that goes from the pharynx down to the stomach. Then we get into the stomach where we can start that digestive process. We have a lot of acid here. Then we get into the small intestine. We start to absorb that into the bloodstream. Then we get into the large intestine, which is really the colon. We start to solidify, compact, and create that bulky waste. Then we get into the rectum where that waste is stored, and then we get into the anus where it can be eliminated. So that is the extent of that hollow muscular tube from mouth all the way through to anus. Now, along the way, we also encounter some accessory glands. These help with secreting fluids, secreting enzymes, even hormones that we'll talk about. And they can release their secretions via ducts into the GI system that will aid in some way with that movement. Okay, let's talk about the layers of this muscular tube. So if we're to take the GI tract and cut it across, a cross-section, nice clean cross-section, and look at our cross-section, we would see several different layers from the internal lumen all the way out to the peripheral, the outermost aspect of that tube. And so we want to think about what those layers are, and then later on talk about how they help with some of the processes that we're going to speak about. So we start with the lumen. This is where the food is located, right? We've got the bolus of food moving through here. And this is first separated, excuse me, from the underlying structures by the epithelia. So the epithelial lining, we talked about epithelia before, it lines all of our hollow organs, and it's going to be the first layer of cells that separates the food from the internal body cavity, which is the rest of the GI. Underneath the epithelial lining, we have the associated connective tissue. This is called the lamina propria. And that is what has the small arteries, the small veins, and the small nerves that help to supply the epithelial lining. Now, we don't really give a whole lecture on epithelia anymore, but epithelia is avascular. It doesn't have its own blood supply. And so it must always have an accompanying connective tissue layer where the blood supply is and where the nerves are. And that is what the lamina propria serves as. Underneath the lamina propria, there is the muscularis mucosae, and these three layers together form the mucosa. So I'll just go over that again here. The mucosa is formed by the epithelial lining, nothing but cells, so cells stacked neatly against each other is the epithelial lining. Underneath that, there is the associated connective tissue, which has the blood vessels and nerves. That is called the lamina propria. And then underneath that, there's a very thin strip of smooth muscle called the muscularis mucosae. And muscularis mucosae literally translates to muscle of the mucosa, right? There's another thicker layer of muscle that we'll talk about. So it's a way to distinguish the thicker layer of muscle that I'll talk about next from this very thin layer of muscle that is a part of the mucosa. Outside of the mucosa, we have the submucosa, right? So sub meaning below, mucosa meaning that innermost layer. So the submucosa is the next layer that we encounter, which is this layer here, right outside of the muscularis mucosae. And this is a thicker layer of connective tissue. It has larger vessels, it has larger nerves. It also has the submucosal plexus, which is also referred to as the Meissner's plexus, which is a part of the enteric nervous system. We'll talk more about this coming up, but this is a branch of the autonomic nervous system that supplies the gut, that supplies the GI. Okay, there are two separate branches. This branch, called the submucosal plexus or the Meissner's plexus, is found in the submucosa. Okay. We'll talk about the function of the submucosa, but it really has the connective tissue that gives the stretchability, elasticity to the GI tract and allows it to accompany large changes in volume. Outside of submucosa, we have the muscularis externa, right? So it just translates to external muscle. Again, it's differentiating it from the internal muscle of the mucosa, which is a thinner layer. And the muscularis externa is a much thicker layer of smooth muscle, okay? It has fibers that are running in different directions. It's got some circular fibers. It's got some longitudinal fibers. And so when this thicker layer of smooth muscle contracts, we can again change the shape of the GI tract to accommodate for propulsion of food. So we can kind of constrict certain areas, relax certain areas, constrict, alternate that, constrict other areas, relax other areas, and gradually guide that food along the tube from the proximal to the distal end. Another important aspect of the muscularis externa is the presence of the Auerbach's plexus. And the Auerbach's plexus, also known as the myenteric plexus, we'll talk about that term coming up later. That is another branch of that autonomic nervous system, the enteric nervous system that supplies the gut as well. Okay. And then the outermost layer here, so the layer drawn in black here, which is directly outside of the muscularis externa, is the serosa. And the serosa is basically a connective tissue layer. And then underneath that is a serous membrane. This is called a mesothelium. This is essentially the same as the visceral layer of the peritoneum. So we would have talked about the peritoneal cavity in lab, and it's that double-walled membrane, a serous membrane, very thin with that thin amount of fluid, really helps to lubricate the movements of the GI, similar to the parietal cavity, similar to the pericardial cavity. And so the visceral part of that is formed by the connection with the serosa. Okay, so just to run through that here quickly again, we have the mucosa being formed by the epithelium, the lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosae. Outside of the mucosa, we have the submucosa, that containing larger vessels and nerves, along with the submucosal plexus. Outside of the submucosa, we have the muscularis externa, thicker layer of smooth muscle, that contains the Auerbach's plexus. And then outside of the muscularis externa, we have the serosa. Okay. And I'm going to capture this drawing and post it with the images today. So if you missed anything, no need to worry. Perfect. Okay, now we spent some time kind of introducing those layers. We'll spend another couple minutes here just going into the more functional aspects of each of those layers and kind of adding some more layers here. So the wall of the GI, we said, has the mucosa, lining of the lumen, the submucosa, that associated connective tissue layer, the muscularis externa, that outer, thicker, smooth muscle layer, and then the sevosa, which is the outer connective tissue, along with the that serous cavity. So let's start by going into some more detail with the mucosa. This is the membrane that comes in contact with our food. So naturally, we're going to see it being the first line of separation from the internal environment and the external environment. It's also going to have some important cells that help with the GI function. These are epithelial cells, right, because they're part of that epithelial lining or membrane. Some of these are absorptive cells. These are tall columnar cells, being a good example, that aid with that movement. We also have exocrine cells. Exocrine cells are these cells with ducts that help to release their secretions into the lumen. And then we have some endocrine cells as well that release their secretions into the blood. Okay. It's got the three layers that we just introduced. So the epithelial lining, the supportive lamina propria, which is connective tissue, and the associated neurovascular structures. And then it's also got a thin muscular layer, the muscularis mucosa. Going into a bit more detail here with the lamina propria of the mucosa, we know that it's connective tissue. We know that it has those small lymphatic, small blood vessels that are really just functioning to supply the epithelia. So they're not functioning to supply the entire tract or the entire wall of the GI. They're just supplying nerve innervation and blood supply to the epithelial layer that I mentioned was avascular, avascular before. It doesn't have its own vasculature. It's also got some lymphoid tissues or lymphatic aggregates, the lymph nodules or lymph nodes, as well as Peyer's patches. We'll talk about Peyer's patches in a future packet, which are a group or an aggregate of lymphatic tissue that help to monitor any toxins, any bacteria, pathogens that are coming through the GI and help to begin to mount an immune response. So it does have some immune function to it as well. And then lastly here, the third layer of the mucosa being the muscularis mucosae. This is a thin layer of smooth muscle. It's got longitudinal fibers. It's also got circular fibers, and it's really important for mixing the luminal contents. So just like we will see with the muscularis externa, the different orientation of those fibers helps to provide this propulsion. So the contraction of some fibers will change the length of the tube. The contraction of other fibers will change the diameter of the tube, and that will overall change the shape in different ways so that the bolus or the chyme inside can be moved from one end to the other. And then getting into the submucosa, this is the outer layer of thicker connective tissue. This helps with the distensibility, the elasticity of the tube itself. So when we see the muscularis mucosa and the muscularis externa contracting, that smooth muscle contracting to change the shape, the elasticity that provides that give is found here with the submucosa. Okay, it also has larger blood vessels, larger lymphatic vessels. We'll talk about what those are and how they're important coming up. And then it's also got the enteric branches, the enteric nervous system branches, which are the submucosal plexus, otherwise known as the Meissner's plexus. And then finally here, or not finally, but the second to last layer, the muscularis externa, we mentioned that it is a thicker layer of smooth muscle. It's got an inner circular layer that changes the diameter, excuse me. It's got a outer longitudinal layer that changes the length. And so the interweaving of the contraction of these two layers is what helps to kind of gradually mulch that food along. And then this also has that myenteric plexus, also known as the Auerbach's plexus, which is a second component of the enteric nervous system. So I'm seeing a question here, what does enteric mean? So enteric means the gut component of the autonomic nervous system. I don't know if you would remember us slightly touching on this when we talked about the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system has these fibers that are going to our other organs, heart, lungs, smooth muscle of our blood vessels and so on. But then there's a special branch of the autonomic nervous system that goes just to the gut, right? And that's why they always refer to as the gut as being the second brain. It has an extensive nervous connection by way of this enteric nervous system, okay? All right. Lastly, here we have the serosa, and the serosa we said was that outermost layer. It has an inner connective tissue layer, and then it has an outer mesothelium, which is another layer of epithelia that is continuous with the peritoneum, right? It's part of that serous layer that eventually is, modified to become the visceral layer of the peritoneal cavity.